Welcome, everyone. And again, thank you for joining us today. My name is Hina Syed, and I am an Associate Director on the Social Impact Team at Intentional Futures, or IF. And for those of you unfamiliar, IF is a B Corp, a certified B Corp certified consultancy based in Seattle. We help leaders across sectors from public, private, philanthropic, turn good intentions into positive impact through research, strategy, and design. We have 4 practice areas: education, digital innovation, and organizational effectiveness, and of course, social impact. And our team is really excited today to welcome you and to host this timely and hopefully dynamic discussion. I personally have spent over a decade working in global health and development. Part of my career was at USAID, and often at the intersection of advocacy, stakeholder engagement, and communication. So it makes me really excited to introduce our group of panelists and the conversation today. After these introductions, we'll move into a 30-minute discussion around what an evolution of the international aid landscape could look like, and what that isn't going to need to take in order to make it a more resilient system moving forward. And then we're hoping to have about 10 minutes of Q&A from the audience. And so if you have any questions, please drop it in the Q&A chat, and we would love to hear from you and get to your question at the end. Before we really dive in, though, I do want to acknowledge that the views shared here today represent the individual views of the panelists and may not be considered the opinions of all panelists. So I just wanted to be mindful of that. And with that, I feel like this isn't a surprise to anyone, but 2025 has really been a whirlwind thus far, and change just keeps coming every day, and the dust feels like it's indefinitely unsettled. One thing that has been clear is that this uncertainty isn't a phase, it's not going away, and it is our new normal. And I think another thing that is clear to all of us is that the global aid sector is at a crossroads. The abrupt and radical shifts in US and European government funding are forcing a transformation unlike anything we've ever seen before. Critical development programs are being dismantled, leaving communities vulnerable and the future of international aid uncertain. I think just yesterday or this morning, I can't even keep track, we learned that the US may be pulling funding from Gavi, which obviously has huge implications for childhood vaccination. So really, it's just kind of learning something new every day. And amid this upheaval, philanthropy and the private sector are being called to step up. Traditionally, these funding streams have been distinct from government aid, and that has allowed them to really fuel innovation and experimentation. But today, a lot of calls are asking them to do more. So with so much at stake, it is no longer a question of if philanthropy and private capital should act, but how and how fast. The choices made now will determine whether we mitigate damage or allow this critical process and trust to unravel. And so that's why we're here today, to move beyond some of the speculation and talk about action, and really think about how can funders from all across the ecosystem respond not reactively, but become proactive architects of a more resilient and funding system. And also, what steps can NGOs take to be more proactive players in their own future? So with that, I would love to introduce our panelists, starting with Lisa Boss, who is the Vice President of Global Development Policy, Advocacy, and Learning at Interaction.
Thanks, great to be here. As noted, my name is Lisa Boss. I lead the government relations and policy effort at Interaction. Interaction is the leading coalition of international NGOs in the United States. We have nearly 170 members that implement about $18 billion in programming annually. Before I came to Interaction last fall, I spent 13 years at World Vision, including as Senior Director of Government Relations. My background also includes time on Capitol Hill working in the U.S. House of Representatives.
Thank you, Lisa. Sherry Lee Erasmus, who's the co-CEO and Chief Learning and Agility Officer at the Accountability Lab.
Hi, everyone. It's so good to be here. Today at the Accountability Lab, I work primarily in the governance and anti-corruption space. mostly across Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. And our work is centered on enabling communities to hold government accountable for the services they should be receiving.
Thank you, Sherry. Dr. Krishna Jaffa, the CEO of Precision Global Health and board member of Unlock Aid.
Thank you, Hina. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you, Intentional Futures, for hosting this panel. I am a clinical epidemiologist and work primarily on health system strengthening at the intersection of gender equality and climate change. With Unlock Aid, we're also trying to shift the conversation on kind of a binary approach to funding to thinking more creatively about the aid we want. And I'll share more about that soon. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Elizabeth Stokely, the Executive Director of Global Washington.
Thanks. So great to be here, and thanks to IF for hosting this important conversation. Elizabeth Stokely, I'm calling in from Seattle, and I lead Global Washington, referencing Washington State. We're a membership organization that supports and promotes the international development community here in Washington State, including nonprofits, foundations, and corporations. And Global Washington activates the Washington State community members to power positive global impact through connection, capacity building, advocacy, and funding. And I myself have worked in global development for over 17 years, including on the ground with Peace Corps and Fulbright, and most recently with financial inclusion nonprofit Axion International.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And last but certainly not least, Lacey Stone, the Chief Development Officer at USA for UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency.
Thanks, Tina. My name is Lacey Stone, as you said, and I serve as the Chief Development Officer at USA for UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, where our mission is to mobilize resources, elevate awareness, and activate a network of engaged supporters to support and protect the more than 122 million women, children, and men who have been forced to flee due to violence, war, and persecution around the world. I've been with USA for UNHCR for nearly 4 years, but I've been in the humanitarian development sector for nearly 20. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah, and I am excited to stop talking and turn it over to y'all for this discussion, starting with a question for Lisa to kick us off. And I think despite the calls for trust-based and courageous action, funders and advocates have remained mostly and largely publicly silent as the community undergoes some seismic shifts. Why must funders across these sectors acknowledge that this uncertainty isn't temporary and that there is risk to progress and credibility of waiting for clarity to act?
Thanks for giving me such an easy question to try to answer to kick us off. You know, I think there are a couple of answers to this question. I think one answer is, as we look to actions of this administration, there have certainly been efforts to have an almost intimidation effect on people kind of speaking out against it. So honestly, for the last 60 or so days, I don't really blame funders, for implementers, and for others for being a bit silent, because I do think the administration has taken steps to intimidate and in some ways punish people who do speak up and do dissent. And we're seeing very troubling signs of that almost every day. But I will say, I think one thing I keep thinking about as we get further maybe through this crisis, although I think you're right, it seems like something new happens every day that makes us realize this isn't quite over yet. But I do look back a bit and think, were there moments we could have pivoted the narrative in a different way? I think foreign assistance and global engagement, the UN, these things got defined very, very quickly in the public sphere, primarily on social media, but also by the president, by members of Congress and others. And I think because we were all relatively quiet for quite some time, now our attempts to shift that narrative and talk about the positive aspects of foreign assistance, of global engagement, of progress on the SDGs it falls a little bit on deaf ears. For funders, I would say, I think everybody is trying to just figure out where to go from here. What's a good strategy? What's a good approach? What do you fund? How do you fund it? What's going to be most important? What's going to be left behind? Those are very hard decisions to make, but I think those decisions should be considered sooner rather than later, in part because I just think some pieces of this work and of the things that we find important are already being destroyed before our very eyes, in some cases also behind the scenes. And I think at some point in the near future, it could be either too late or very, very difficult to restore things that are lost. So I think the sooner we can act, the better, to maintain progress, maintain services, maintain trust.
I love the emphasis on trust there. And Lacey, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in because I think this question it's such an important one. And Lisa, you've really kind of teed it up quite nicely. And I think from the USA for UNHCR side that I'll speak from, right? Like, I'll be really clear that the impact of this funding crunch on refugees' lives is already devastating, and it's going to get far worse. So these cuts are coming on top of longstanding shortfalls in humanitarian assistance, and the impact of that is both immediate and severe. Concretely, we're talking about critical medicines, emergency shelter, food, relief items, clean water, protection services, and that includes to children and to survivors of sexual violence and trafficking. Those will either reduce or stop entirely. And what is not stopping is conflict. Wars will continue to force thousands to flee their homes to save their lives. And these funding cuts mean that those who are in danger are not going to receive assistance, and ultimately lives will be lost. And so the life-saving needs that we know exist today will only therefore multiply in the weeks and the months ahead, which will result in even a larger looming humanitarian crisis of immense and truly preventable proportions. And so every day that funding is stalled means that more lives are put at risk. And quite frankly, we don't have time to spare. And so while these are historic challenges, I've heard that phrase a number of times, to kind of put the other spin on it, it's also an historic opportunity for donors and for the private sector to really step up and make a huge impact and difference, and to be the champions, as well as ourselves in the sector, to champion humanitarian aid for people who need it.
Great. And I completely agree about trying to shift it from a challenge to an opportunity. And I think that's one of the things we really want to talk about today is what do those opportunities look like? And the other thing that I love that you mentioned is we talk about how unpredictable the current funding landscape is, given all the news that might come out, but also we're responding to unpredictable challenges and unpredictable things happening all around the world, from climate things that happen and from the refugee crises, wars, new diseases, outbreaks, just like we can't plan. So how do you manage all this unpredictability at once? And I think that really goes into why flexibility isn't just a buzzword right now. It really is necessary. So Elizabeth, I'm curious how you think philanthropy's private sector can build flexibility into their strategies to stay relevant, effective, and reimagine what was perhaps not serving us before, and us being our global community, not just US-based organizers, and staying attuned to community needs.
Sure, Hannah. And again, easy question, right? Easy question, easy answer. No, it's such an important nuance and question. I mean, we're faced with, again, historic dismantling, destruction, and attack really on the sector. And how then can we pivot and really use this as an opportunity to rebuild? And as Lisa said, I mean, I really share her and our urgency for this. I mean, lives are being lost every day. We at Global WA, over 114 member organizations, 85% of our organizations are directly or indirectly impacted by these cuts. Those that aren't yet will be. They've just, frankly, too small yet to feel the direct impact. But everyone in this sector in the US, and of course, the humanitarian aspect abroad, is already feeling this. And we're going to be seeing some organizations starting to shut their doors imminently in the next few months. So really, the urgency can't be overstated. We're talking about over $60 billion taken out essentially overnight from this industry. And I think we are kind of, playing catch up here in terms of the narrative, because I think this in some ways was just unexpected and caught folks off guard how quickly it happened. But I in my conversations with folks, people are surprised to hear, like, according to the Institute for Development Impact, America earns $8.52 return for every dollar invested by USAID. Here in Washington State, nonprofits that are engaging internationally receive millions and millions of dollars through, but they return that to the state and then some. Over 40% of jobs in the state actually depend on foreign trade. So we really have to think about how we can pivot the narrative that has been, put out there since earlier this year. And global development makes the US and Washington State stronger, healthier, and safer. And so, taking a step back, this is a massive void. Honestly, philanthropy is not going to be able to fill the void entirely. But we have to try, and we have to act quickly. So according to Giving USA, there's $100 billion per year of foundation charitable giving in the US. If together foundations raised giving even from 5 to 6%, as MacArthur and others have made commitments to do, it might result in an additional $20 billion to the sector per year. So, still a fraction of the void, but I think we have to think about, okay, that they're even, what could be seen as modest modifications to operations might be able to have really, really significant impact. So I think it really comes down to being willing to try new things. Again, to your point of flexibility, thinking about new approaches to partnership and coalition building, thinking about new, more flexible funding models that include audiences, new audiences, and new ways of leveraging technology, including AI. I know, AI is such a hot button word, and full disclosure, I've spent the last couple of days at the Microsoft Nonprofit Leaders Summit, so very top of mind. But really, I think this is coming down to hearts and minds, us appealing to hearts and minds, and how we can tell the story, which may not have been as effectively told to date to common constituents in the US of what the US gets in return, and really the deep meaning of how we engage globally. And I do think that AI can have a role to play there in terms of storytelling and awareness building. So I'll stop there. Lots more to say, but I know that some funders are stepping up, but I think a lot more needs to be done.
Yeah, I like that you intertwine the flexibility with the also being flexible in how we're talking. I think it goes to, Lisa, your point as well, is people made quick decisions, maybe not based off of the most accurate information. So something to continue to think about. And Krishna, love to hear from you.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on what Elizabeth shared in sort of, surfacing two important things that appear to be very closely related and complementary, but actually might be working in some opposition to each other in this moment of change and potential opportunity. One is that aid is essential and life-saving. Just yesterday, the WHO published findings from a recent modeling study that suggested between 4.5 million and close to 11 million new HIV infections are going to happen, including almost 1 million children are going to become infected with HIV. And as an HIV epidemiologist who's been on the front lines since the mid 1990s, to see those hard fought gains be lost is so deflating. And yet, this is when we show up, and yet we persist, and yet we are resilient, right? So there is that very real thing about aid being essential and life-saving. There's also the truth that aid needs reform. And the ways in which aid needs reform are more funding needs to go toward proven interventions that already exist. More funding needs to be directed toward in-country organizations, and country governments need to step up where they can and have the resources that they have to be able to contribute meaningfully toward the reformation that could happen. What is challenging for us in this moment is that the transition from supporting essential aid to transitioning it thoughtfully to country government or other in-country actors is not even given a chance. It's happened so abruptly and so quickly that just yesterday I heard about patients, both HIV and TB patients, being unable to receive the medicines because staff from implementing organizations have been laid off. And you're hearing the story over and over and over again. This is going to have very serious impacts, not just for the countries that are impacted, but very directly for the US. That is going to see a surge in TB, in HIV, and other infections that cross borders. Thank you.
Yeah. Sherry, do you want to jump in?
And apologies for probably breaking up your entire flow here, Hina, but yeah, Krishna was making such a good point that I want to be slightly controversial about, and it's this idea of moving towards like proving things that work, right? Which is really important. And we should absolutely be funding things that work. The challenge is shaping what we mean by that, because I've seen so many posts in recent days around sort of like quantifiable things, right? Things that we can count. And, how that then almost creates a case for a foreign aid investment. Now, the reality is, I agree with that. And at the same time, things like governance work, and I see a couple of colleagues on the call here, is less quantifiable within the span of a year. When we work on things like democracy, human rights, anti-corruption, those things take time to mature. And we work with so many variables. We can't say we've serviced 5,000 patients this month, for example. And however, creating strong institutions, creating safe spaces where people live and work, ensuring that people have human rights and freedom of speech, those things are so intersectional with people's health and well-being in other ways. And they also create the spaces where governments can then in time provide the services that are needed and that are to some degree at this point largely funded by foreign aid. And so I think we need to, this is also, we have a moment here where we can still control what this narrative looks like and how we talk about what is actually, the things we should be funding and what's quantifiable.
I think that is a really important reminder, and please, for all of you, disrupt the flow as much as you need to. I think that that's the better way to have this discussion anyway. And I think that, Sherry, what you just said ties really nicely into this idea of how can the future of aid be reshaped so that it is more focused on local communities and solutions that work in reality and aren't really numbers based, and so kind of driven towards results and what someone many, many miles away thinks should happen versus what actually needs to happen on the ground. Do you see any tangible steps that funders can take to shift from a donor-driven model to really community-led approaches, and how to inform this type of movement that you're speaking to?
Yeah, thanks, Hina. And we've been in these cycles of trying out localization for a very long time, right? Like with all the collective experience we have on this call, everyone's been through several cycles. And like we deeply believe in this. Like people should be at the forefront of making the change in their communities. So firstly, I want to say that absolutely the power should be within communities. Um, at this moment of uncertainty, I think the most important thing donors can do is be an enabler and a supporter of the organizations they've been supporting to help them in this moment of crisis reimagine and realign what their work looks like. Because ultimately, many organizations are floundering. Elizabeth said that, imminently many are closing. Based on the data we've collected at Accountability Lab, by the end of March, we've heard from about 800 organizations. By the end of March, around 200 organizations would have to close their doors. It gets worse when you get to April and May. People are hanging on by their fingernails. And so there are a couple of very practical things organizations can do, but that are not free, that donors and others can support us to do. Firstly, we're forced into a reimagination. And we talk about we're in it together, but then we never really have been, right? We're kind of in it together in the sector, but we've also always been in competition with each other for funding. I think this moment forces us to think about how we partner with each other in very practical ways. One way of that is to think about strategic partnerships. If we have 50% of our portfolio left, and so does another organization, are there ways to work better together? Should we even potentially consider a more formal strategic partnership or a merger so that we keep at least some of both ships alive in a way? I think that is something that organizations should very strongly consider at the moment, and adopting a more movement mindset versus the siloed approach that we've had in competition with each other in a very long time. And that might be being more collaborative and sharing resources. And again, like plugging holes, because we talk about the intersectionality of our issues, but actually we don't work together that well often. And I think now is a moment to have a real big tent approach to how healthcare and education and governance issues do intersect, and how we can use the very few resources we have together to actually, I don't know, strengthen each other's work. And then the third piece, I think that's a pivot that many of us will have to make, where again, donors can give us the spaciousness to buy time to reimagine these things, is how can we better engage governments and also the private sector. Because ultimately, when you look at multinationals, their operating environment downstream in the supply chain in places in the majority world will ultimately change. The livelihoods of their workforce will be changed due to lack of access to services, due to peace building and stabilization work no longer taking place. And so I think there's a real incentive for private sector to get on board with us. And similarly, to Krishna's point, sorry, we have to be working actively with governments in different countries to have them understand the necessity for them to really take on the responsibility of the services that have been lost. But all of these things take time and brain power and expertise to think through, and many of that is not on hand in our organizations. So I think philanthropies and other partners can help us with the resources to pivot in many ways.
Lacey, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to double click on something mentioned, which is that flexibility piece, and specifically the notion of flexible funding and just how important flexible funding is, that necessarily puts more power in local communities and allows local communities to make the decisions themselves for what is needed, what solutions are going to work in their local settings. I think right now, we have seen over the course of many decades, the donor-driven model really does necessitate haves and have-nots. And so when you think about it in an emergency context, for example, there may be a handful of emergency situations that will make the headlines in the United States and will grab the attention of the public. But UNHCR, for example, responded to 43 unique emergency situations in the last year alone, most of which never saw the CNN, the BBC headlines. And so in order to provide a more equitable approach to who receives humanitarian assistance, that flexible funding is required. So it's not just those receiving assistance who happen to be in geographic settings that make the headlines, but rather human rights approach and a dignity-based approach is enabled through flexible funding that allows the organizations that are mandated to respond to emergencies to be able to use those funds to reach those who need the support the most, not necessarily only those who are in the headlines day over day. All humans are deserving of our support and generosity and compassion. And I think that more flexible funding is really the only way for us to provide that more equitable form of assistance.
I completely agree. I have done a lot of work in preparedness, and we've all heard the term the cycle of panic and neglect. But I feel like this cycle is really driven by the media and who decides that we are now in a cycle of panic or neglect when really it's a constant thing, that we shouldn't really name it as something like that. It actually can have detrimental impact. And Elizabeth, I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Sure. Just, I mean, couldn't agree more, Lacey, with what you're saying. And I think, we saw many funders implement or evolve their practices during COVID, during pandemic to be more flexible, to consider more unrestricted funding that really helps communities be more at the center and lead those implementation efforts. I mean, as you said, as everyone on this call understands, these challenges that we're working to address are incredibly complex, incredibly difficult, and to really do them right, it takes time. It takes trust building. It takes, really knowing who the local leaders and those that know the problems and the solutions best, and helping them, have access to the leadership and the power they need. So, I mean, all of these things, systems change, policy influence, community resilience, what have you. I mean, it's just, it takes time, and we have to, I think, just look beyond those really short-term metrics. And that's really what it takes, I think, on the funding side, for funders, and understand, funders have to answer to their boards and others as well. But it is kind of this reimagining risk. And, MacArthur put out their, a bit about, their discussions behind the curtain to increase their floor from 5 to 6%. And I found it really, really resonant. I mean, hopefully it can help inspire others. I mean, I think, some will say they can and should go further, but I mean, we have to start somewhere. And I think just even going back to some of those practices that funders committed to during the pandemic, some have continued, some have, reverted more to old practices, but really thinking about longer term partnership, and more unrestricted funding, I think is just really fundamental.
And I really love the really shaping up of what a movement could look like, and not just talking about it in theory, but thinking about the narrative that has to change, what type of approaches need to be taken from either side. And so, Krishna, from your perspective, I'm curious what you think funders or individual donors need to hear, whether that's data, impact narratives, community insights, in order to actually make the shifts in their strategies, and what's missing from what they're hearing today.
Yeah, thanks, Hina. And I think, just to start out, picking up on the great points that Sherry made earlier, I think it's really, really important to take an intersectional approach and to recognize that transformational change in human well-being takes time. You can't fast track it in many ways. There are things that are urgent and that are here and now and that need to be addressed, else we end up being in a far worse situation. And as speaking as a person who spent my entire adult life working on health in developing countries, that's probably the area, and in the US, that's probably the area that I feel most qualified to speak to. If you aren't providing the life-saving HIV and TB meds today, skipping even one dose of TB meds can result in drug resistance. Multi-drug resistant TB is much more expensive. TB is a highly infectious disease. I had it as a kid. It's not fun. And it kills. It's one of the largest killers amongst infectious diseases. So that's a very stark reminder of the need for urgency to be able to fill the gap for life-saving services right here, right now. I would argue the same is true for any refugee or IDP settings, internally displaced people settings that Lacey's highlighted, right? They can't wait. And understanding that urgency is real is very important. As part of that effort, so my small modest contribution is I volunteer on the board of Unlock Aid, and I'm also serving on the investment committee of the Foreign Aid Bridge Fund. I think as of yesterday, we've been able to disperse about $1.5 million. We're in the process of doing a little bit more. It's very much a drop in the bucket. But for anyone who wants to hear a little bit more about the Foreign Aid Bridge Fund, please visit the Unlock Aid website and you'll get a little bit more information about it. There are many other worthy efforts ongoing in that space of the bridging funding. The second very, very important thing is that intersectional approach that I mentioned, and that needs looking at not just health and human rights, gender equality, the effects of climate change. All three are areas that I incorporate into a lot of the work that I do. One example of why it's so important is unless you've got shifts in social norms happening on the ground, you're not going to see any increases in modern contraceptive use. Unless you see enabling regulation and policy to promote universal health coverage, you may not see the actual allocation of funding in a government budget toward universal health coverage, which is a basic human right. Health is a human right. So when you start looking at that intersection between taking that rights-based approach, which is what all public health is based on, and thinking about what else needs to be part of the story, you can take a far more holistic approach. And like Sherry said, I think it does need to be much more of a big tent approach where we are learning from each other. That's going to take time. It is also going to need accountability of country governments. And if you look at Africa alone, there are 22 countries that have sovereign wealth funds. How are those wealth funds actually being deployed? How are they being used today? Worth considering and worth looking into. There is very active civil society across the continent of Africa, and I hope that they're going to start asking questions about where do our taxes go? Where do our resources go? Where do the profits from petroleum sales go? From other precious minerals go? And how are they being used to improve the well-being of citizens within our country? Those are really important questions to ask. And I think critically important is a much, much more intentional partnership with the private sector. I work very, very closely with private sector players, especially in health supply chains. And it is crazy how different the two worlds, the two worldviews might be across public and private sector. I think we really need to start thinking creatively about how we bring the private sector to the table, recognize them as actors who already have a significant presence. I think Elizabeth, someone else had mentioned that earlier, and really start stitching together a multi-sectoral response to this crisis and see it as an opportunity to do better. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Elizabeth, go ahead.
Sure. I just wanted to build on that, Krishna, and it's a bit, I think, of a rallying cry. I would like to address as well the question in the Q&A related to efforts in the Seattle community to support our aid community. I mean, that's really what this is what Global Washington is all about. The vision when we were, founded 20 years ago was, we have Gates Foundation, we have major corporations, we have very important nonprofits and NGOs in our community doing this work, and UW and other academic institutions. And how do we help bring down those silos? How do we get sectors to work together and talk to each other, and researchers and implementers? And so I think this is really where our we are wanting to step up and use that member network and those voices that we have in our community to engage. So I wanted to address specifically this question and the bringing the private sector to the table, because this is something that we're actively doing in smaller conversations. But I think I'd like to put out the call as well that if anyone on this call or listening, is interested in being part of a collective effort, I'd like to talk to you, because I'm having those conversations every day, and we are forming an engaged and active community on these issues. So would love to talk to you, because it's in process.
And if I could just quickly add to that, being a Seattleite by choice, not a native Seattleite, it's a very vibrant and giving community. And Seattle King County Clinic, which takes place every year at Seattle Center, is hosted by the Seattle Center Foundation. It's a really nice example of multi-sectoral collaboration, which happens not just for health, but then homelessness, a bunch of other things. On a lighter note, I volunteer pretty actively in the dog rescue community, and it's been so amazing to learn from them about how, like they just come together across the sectors, be it donations from pet stores to the boots on the ground who are doing search and rescue, to the nonprofits that are helping, alleviate the issue, to medical providers, veterinary providers, things like that. So I think there's a lot we can learn from other related worlds as well.
You both did such a good job of teeing up the next question about the idea that no single sector can solve the international aid gap by itself. And Elizabeth, you touched on some key facts early on in the discussion about what that gap actually looks like. And Lacey, from your perspective, how do you see these types of cross-sector partnerships really supporting a more resilient aid model? And do any examples of how this has been done before come to mind, or currently being done?
Yeah, and I'll start just by adding another +1 for Global Washington. Really proud member of Global Washington and a terrific community. So Elizabeth, you're just doing a really fantastic job, and recommend anybody in Washington State to look into Global Washington because it is fostering this brilliant community. So I started my career in private sector partnerships, and that's the work that I continued to do at USA for UNHCR before transitioning into this new role. And when I think about cross-sector partnerships, I'm going to really be taking a cue from my playbook in working specifically in the private sector partnership space and across different industries within the private sector, as well as how the public sector might be able to support some of those initiatives. But I'll start just by saying that cross-sector partnership space and those who are within a space to be able to join in a cross-sector partnerships, those can really play such a crucial role to help build a more resilient aid model. I think that by leveraging the strengths of different industries, and then also by diversifying funding sources, that leads to more innovation. That collaboration leads to more efficient aid delivery. And one of the examples that immediately comes to mind where I've seen this be successful within UNHCR space is our Multi-Religious Council of Leaders and our Interfaith Initiative. So this Multi-Religious Council of Leaders is brought together by UNHCR and an NGO, Religions for Peace. They are working together to mobilize faith communities that will then advocate for policies. Those policies provide protection for refugees. There's an awareness element and speaking out against discrimination and stigmatization. These communities are also promoting peace, reconciliation, and social cohesion in their respective regions and also globally. And then the members of that initiative are supporting both global and local advocacy campaigns. They're helping to facilitate community sponsorship, working with local NGOs in their communities. Also, those NGOs focused on resettlement, working even within schools to help on education programs, and then working with the corporate sector on employment programs, lobbying for legislative reforms, and finally contributing to philanthropic initiatives by mobilizing members of their faith communities to give. And so these are all just some of the ways that members of that council are committing to ensuring that there is meaningful participation at all levels, and that includes a responsibility to ensure that refugees themselves are included in participating at those gatherings and at those meetings. I think what's important to remember in that example and more broadly is that the private sector, which includes individuals, corporations, foundations, NGOs, faith-based groups, civil society groups, the private sector can play a much bigger role than we might think. And this is not just in terms of financial donations, which of course is so important and so urgently needed, but also in terms of really working collaboratively to leverage their own influence and to help develop solutions. There are some simple examples of what we would call, mixed gifts that combine product donations that an organization may have as part of their own service model, as well as in-kind service delivery, like software licenses being donated, and then, of course, the financial component. And then I'll just say that in the international development space, I think that we can move from a reactive and short-term model to a more proactive, sustainable, and resilient system. But I'll go back to my intervention several minutes ago, which is that for this to occur, we have to work collaboratively with our donors and our partners to push for that flexible funding. That flexible funding is going to allow organizations to respond quickly, to allocate resources effectively, and to adapt to evolving challenges. And so that flexible funding allows for not just the rapid emergency or crisis response that I mentioned earlier, but it also empowers and strengthens the local leadership to enable those who are at the center of the challenge themselves to make those decisions based on the real-time needs rather than the external mandates. And then I'll just share one final example, and that is around pooled funding. Pooled funds are, I think, a really great example of how we can move towards this cross-sectoral collaborative model. And so within UNHCR, we have what's called the Emergency Action Fund. The Emergency Action Fund is a place where donors and partners can contribute to this pooled fund that allows us to be ready the moment an emergency hits and then to prepare to respond to the next disaster without having to wait until the next emergency strikes to help those who are affected. And what I'm seeing kind of more and more, and I've been really motivated by, is that in times of emergency, and I'll use the Ukraine emergency as the example, when Russia invaded Ukraine, there was a lot of collaboration happening in our space, even at the US level with other UN organizations, WFP USA, USA for UNHCR, UNICEF USA, working together, approaching a corporation or approaching a private sector company to really appeal as a one UN response rather than this kind of competition for what might seem as finite or limited resources. These organizations are already collaborating on the ground in response to the emergency. So I think what we can do within the United States and as fundraising organizations is to drive more of that collaboration proactively, so that for our funders, it makes it much easier that they're not seeming to have to choose, one or the other, but rather they're seeing how these efforts are complementary as opposed to in competition to one another.
Yeah, Lacey, I like that you brought back competition, because I think that's something that a few of you have touched on, is that's another reality of this sector, is a lot of these organizations have been in competition with each other for funding, for grants, and now it's a new normal. And what does that look like, and how does competition transform into collaboration? And Lisa, I see your hands up and we haven't heard from you, so I would love to hear what you think about that. Not calling you
I'm
out,
such a
but I'm
process
excited
person
for it.
sometimes. I'm not an interrupter always, but on this idea of competition, and I don't want to overly speak from self-interest, but I do think, coalitions, spaces where there's already collaboration and value add, and kind of convening power, I think are going to be really vital spaces going forward. To me, this also ties into the sector shrinking and, having come 7 months ago from an implementing organization, I know that this was often the challenge internally when we went through, the COVID and other kind of financial crises. When you look at where to reduce funding, you often think that things like advocacy are extra and unnecessary. You might think that certain degrees of like M&E or comms, again, at times from a CEO level, you're trying to preserve programming, you're trying to preserve what you actually deliver as part of your mission. Other things can at those points in times seem extra or additive or less important. And I think that's where coalitions can really add that capacity in a way that is irreplaceable because, resources can be developed and shared. And I think one thing that's been so interesting about this crisis has been where we've seen coalitions that even are often in competition with each other come together. I think especially in the DC space where I am, and I'm guessing elsewhere, we're sharing information in ways we haven't before. We're developing joint strategies in ways we haven't before. We're not claiming pride of ownership in ways that we haven't before. So my hope coming out of this, if there is any sort of positive or bright light, that sort of collaboration even continues, because where there can be individual NGO competition, certainly for member organizations, coalitions, there's a similar degree of competition, but hopefully this is showing us ways we can move past that.
Sherry, do you have anything to add?
Firstly, Lisa, you made me really hopeful, just by what you're saying. Like, we need more of that collaboration. On the flexible funding thing, I just feel like over many years, I've been in so many flexible funding conversations. This is not new to donors. Everyone knows we need flexible funding. In my sector, there's less and less core funding available every year. It's literally striking gold at this point. And like we've gotten through COVID, we've literally learned nothing from that. Sadly, as a human race, we keep repeating the same things. So everyone understands the needs. And so what I want to encourage us to do is, donors, if we think about philanthropies, they have their own structure and guidelines internally. Do I think some of it could probably be tweaked in times of need? Absolutely. But at the same time, people are also very fearful of losing their own tax status. And so that also makes them not want more risk averse, right? Not wanting to make quick changes around converting something to flexible funding. And so I think we need to go with actually quite tangible asks. For example, instead of saying like, can this pot of funding be converted to flexible? One thing that might help is saying, hey, my organization may need to use these funds like for a longer period than, I don't know, it ending in August, for example, which is when the project cycle would have ended. I think I've personally seen more success making tangible asks that lead you to more flexibility at the outcomes level, but that isn't just asking for flexible funding, because I've not personally seen a lot of success with that. So I wonder how we frame asks that are very practical and that are doable within donor guidelines that ultimately lead us to broader flexibility.
Krishna and then Lacey to close out the question.
Yeah, thank you. Just building on that, I think there are a number of ways you can think about flexible funding, and all of them have their pros and their cons. Is flexible funding good? Absolutely. If you think about outcomes-based funding for the types of interventions that can be counted, right, where you can actually count outcomes relatively easily, I think being less process-driven and more outcomes-driven would be one way to approach greater flexibility and lift some of that burden. On the flip side, there's also the reality of needing to have honest conversations about sustainability and about transition to local ownership. And I think if we miss that part of it, and if we don't set up necessary processes as part of our forced or intentional collaborations today, then I think we might end up sort of, continuing to replicate the issues that have historically plagued foreign aid. And I think this really is an important wake-up moment for us to say, yes, we all want to do the right thing and seek to do the right thing, but are we actually getting to most of the aid going to the people whom it's intended to help? If the answer is, I don't really know, or yes, but, then I think we just need to have those honest conversations with ourselves and within our community. And unless we have that, I don't really see how we would meaningfully move forward. On a positive note, I think a lot of donors have worked at the Gates Foundation as well. I think a lot of donors do bring a great deal of flexibility to their thinking, and private philanthropy in particular, I think, has done an amazing job in allowing for it. Things like no cost extensions or shifting, the results, or allowing for outcomes-based approaches, things like that. I really do hope that they will continue to do it and to educate donors who may sort of take more traditional activity-based kind of approaches. Thanks.
Lacey, anything to wrap
Yeah,
up
and
with?
Krishna actually kind of answered exactly what I was going to intervene with, is that I wonder if there's space for some of the donors and the supporters who have shifted to a more flexible funding model to serve as those champions for why exactly this is so important and how that shift has allowed them to transform their own philosophy around giving and really serve as those models for how the sector as a whole can move into that direction. I do think that there is some middle ground, and I'm speaking specifically for the USA for UNHCR funding model. It's not, we do have unrestricted being the most flexible funding there is. We have tightly earmarked funds that are going specifically to a type of program within a specific country in a specific region. But then there's this middle ground where maybe we can shift, maybe the shift is from the tightly earmarked directly to unrestricted funding, but maybe instead it's a shift to broad restricted. And so when we have the opportunity to speak to our supporters and our donors who are wanting to support a very specific shelter program in a specific community in a country, could we instead shift that narrative to focus on the overall impact that their support could have if they were to broaden that support to be at a country level or at a region level or at an emergencies overall level? And so I think, and that requires personal one-on-one conversations, understanding the impact that our donors are wanting to make, and then finding the proposal and the program that closely align and allow us to make the impact that they desire. But I do think there's some middle ground, and I think that we should leverage the voices of the supporters who have shifted to that model, to leverage those voices to really be the champions for how this has helped them and how their thinking has evolved, as opposed to, from me and my space, always, as a nonprofit that is needing funding, here's how we need donors to change. It's just shifting kind of who is the messenger of that narrative.
Yes, I love the idea of kind of taking it back to storytelling and who are the ones really championing that story, and what stories are we telling and how are we doing it together versus separately. And I love ending on that note. And we are at time, and I think we're kind of just scratching the surface of all the things that we could talk about. But I do just have one last question for y'all, kind of going to Lisa's vibe of your answer, kind of ending with that hope. And that is, for each of you, amidst all this uncertainty, what gives you the most conviction that progress is still possible in the year ahead? And I can start while y'all have a second to think. For me, it really is thinking about moving this competition to collaboration and thinking about the space that coalitions take, or what kind of joint platforms are going to come up, but really thinking about coming together and rethinking what competition should look like. Lisa.
I would double tap that one, but I think I would also add to that there are just so many people committed to this work that will scrape and work and advocate and find a way to make it happen. I think that continued commitment we'll come out of this, we'll come out of this very differently, but hopefully with some of the same, smart, dedicated people doing this work, going forward for decades to come.
Elizabeth.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think it's similar to what has been said, but I just come back to, and I've had in my head for weeks now, the writer Margaret Wheatley said, "For any problem, community is the answer," and it's so true. Like I've seen on the bright side, just people wanting to be in community more now more than ever. And to Lisa's point, like I've had so many conversations, people are like, they don't underestimate the nonprofit and international global development folks, right? Like, speak all the folks, myself and everyone on this call have worked in, incredibly tough situations. Just this is like, you don't go into this work for an easy career. Let's just say that. And it's like, I think people are so resourceful, so scrappy, so determined, so resilient. And I really have been seeing that come through. And I think, I've seen the same thing Lisa was nodding to, which is like traditional competitors, traditional frenemies. Like I think people coming together, sharing, wanting to be in community, and really this cross-sectoral aspect too. So that's what I come away with, is just we have to continue leaning on each other and working together.
Great. Maybe Lacey, Sherry, and Krishna.
Sure. I'll just say, while government funding certainly plays a really critical role, it's never been the sole driver of progress, right? We have civil society, the private sector, philanthropy, everyday people are continuing to step up. And I think this proves that compassion and commitment don't pause even when politics does. I'm also really heartened to see these new models of collaboration emerge. We have businesses investing in social impact, local organizations, including faith-based groups, are taking the lead in crisis response. We're seeing innovative financing mechanisms fill critical gaps. And I think history has shown that even in times of political or economic uncertainty, progress is still possible when people refuse to accept inaction as an option. And so I just encourage us to continue to defy indifference by defending humanity.
Sherry.
I can only say yes, and like literally everything I thought of saying has already been said, but I think there's just a really powerful moment here for reimagining, and I see people really step into that space looking for opportunities, but also taking agency over us crafting a pathway for the sector because it's changing, and we can either have it be formed for us or we can have a role in it. And I see people really taking up that challenge in different ways, and that gives me a lot of strength.
I listen to people in the countries I seek to serve or in the communities I seek to serve. I'm really excited to see that that is beginning to happen more profoundly and more consistently. I look at challenges and so many challenges one faces in doing this kind of work as sometimes, interesting constraints that then breed innovation and then collaboration. And I really do believe in the power of collaboration. I see it every day, seeing it on this panel and beyond.